Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. I had barley and if you're following from the last episode, I had to close early. This is the third episode in the series on Mill. I had to close early because I was kind of having a hard time speaking from not eating. So I've done that. I had some delicious, like I said, barley and beans. The beans were a mix of pinto black and garbanzo. They had some ham from leftover Christmas ham from my mom in the area. And I froze it for all this time, and then I made beans with it a few months ago, and then I froze them, and I'm about to finish them. And the barley is from a friend. Um, some of the garbanzo beans were from a food bank, and I had some shredded cheese and some sour cream that I bought myself. And I think I paid for the pinto beans. I think they were from Canarsie. I've been hanging on to them the whole like few years. And probably the black beans too, also from Canarsie. They were raw. I like sorted them, soaked them, put them in a crock pot overnight. Fun fact, um, they're gonna like swell up a bunch, so don't put that many in there because they kind of like couldn't finish cooking because they ran out of space. Um, which is great. It's plentiful. Everything is bountiful and wonderful. All is well and all will remain well. That's a good phrase that everybody should know. It's well, all will be well. It's from a martyr and a saint, Julian of Norwich. I think she was a martyr. Anyway, she was also she was a Christian mystic and kind of like a philosopher too. So the way that she used it though had a sort of pragmatic connotation to it, the exact same way that James will say that what we believe pans out, and so we have good reason to believe good things will happen simply because by believing them, they're more likely to happen. Oh, I didn't even show you guys Julian. Do every single time. So let's jump back into utilitarianism. Um, the introduction to it by John Schroyer and the series on it. So the last thing we read was, but rather than looking for more complicated ways of combining equality and total happiness, let's look briefly at a second problem facing this approach, one that calls into question its basic assumption. There is a very good reason for holding that equality is not, in fact, an intrinsic good. It seems to most philosophers and economists that any distributional change that makes at least one person better off and no one worse off is an improvement. Conversely, any change that makes at least one person worse off and no one better off is a worsening. But if equality is an intrinsic good, then downward leveling will always be at least a presumptive improvement, and it will be an absolute improvement if it involves no loss in total net utility. But consider a situation in which nine people are at happiness level 5 and a 10th person is at level 15. It doesn't seem even a presumptive improvement from a utilitarian point of view to reduce the 10th person's happiness level to 5. Up to this point, we have been considering distributions of happiness. If we look instead at alternative distributions of economic goods, things are different. There is a strong prima facie utilitarian argument for downward redistribution of unequally distributed economic goods, given what economists call the decreasing marginal utility of such goods, i.e., the tendency for people to get less utility per unit of economic good as the amount of that good they have increases. Suppose that nine people have 5 apples each and a 10th person has 15 apples, and that each wants all the apples she can get. It seems likely that taking 9 of the 10th person's apples and giving 1 to each of the others will in fact increase total net utility. This is doubtless what Jem Dixon, the protagonist of Kingsley Amos's Lucky Femme, is alluding to in the following exchange. Bertrand looked quickly around the group, then went on. But their home policy, soak the rich, I mean. Well, it is that, pure and simple, isn't it? Pretending not to notice Margaret's warning frown and Carol's expectant grin, Dixon said quietly, well, what's wrong with it, even if it is that and no more? If one man's got 10 buns and another's got two, and a bun has to be given up by one of them, then surely you take it from the man with 10 buns. A similarly instrumental argument for the equal distribution of social benefits can be derived from the fact that unequal distribution of these benefits tends to produce resentment and social unrest. But there is nothing in classical utilitarianism that favors equality in itself. If a person believes that an equal distribution of happiness is sometimes better than an unequal one, even though the unequal distribution is a greater sum, the classical utilitarian must contend that this is an illusion. But the utilitarian need not claim that the illusion is ungrounded. Indeed, it rests securely on the generally accepted assumption that equal distributions of economic goods and other social benefits tend to maximize total happiness. But that's more at the level of rule than act, as a ground. That's what Mill says, is that the utilitarianism is a ground for where we have our laws, not a determination for what to do in every situation. The laws then become the determination of what to do in every situation. And we're not talking about law in Plato's sense, nor law in Kant's sense here. We're talking about um, legalism, unfortunately, which is a sort of following procedure and following written things, written maxims. Again, Donald Davidson is a really interesting way that we had, I think it's mental events. Yeah. Um, Mental events by Donald Davidson kind of explains how things might be laws and reality might be lawful, but it might not be translatable to the mind or presentable on this side of reality. Um, or it might not be that we can write it down. And it might be that the mind and the basically I think he's actually really saying that the mind and the body interact in a lawful way. But that doesn't mean we can understand it or give it a causal principle. It's like lawful, but not necessarily directly causal, where one causes the other. Um, but yeah, when Mill and Bentham and Troyer talk about, and utilitarians in general talk about laws, and economists talk about laws, obviously they're talking about laws as written, not laws as autonomously determined by the categorical imperative inherent in every human being, or the dialectic of the souls of the journey of the cave. I turn now to difficulties concerning the measurement of happiness. In discussing the distribution of happiness, numbers were assigned to various levels of happiness, without any mention of how they might be derived, or whether in fact it makes any sense to assign numbers at all. Generous readers with doubts about the intelligibility of quantifying happiness may have simply ignored the numbers in the sample distributions, taking them to be heuristic fictions of some sort. When I was reading them, I kind of glossed over them like that. Like I really didn't think about them, or I just kind of tried to get through them as fast as possible. But utilitarians need to take this sort of quantification illustrated by the sample distribution seriously, and it's difficult to. If it makes no sense to say that one lot of happiness, to use Bentham's phrase, is twice as great as another, then it will make no sense to say things like giving a bun to a man with 9 buns produces less happiness than giving a bun to a man with only 1 bun. Bentham himself had no qualms about assigning numbers to lots of happiness. Indeed, he gloried in it. So lot is like, I guess, like the whole or total subjective perception and felt translation from quantity. It's like a sort of, it sounds like they're trying to spatialize it. Uh, a lot, it's like a yard or it takes up a container. Some allotments might be bigger. He gloried in it. Chapter 4 of Principles of Morals and Legislation contains, and like really we're talking about psychoaffective space here with lots. You okay, Winchester? just breathing heavy. Chapter 4 of Principles of Morals and Legislation contains what is often called Bentham's hedonic calculus, complete with its memorator verses. Intense, long, certain, speedy, fruitful, pure. Such marks in pleasures and in pains endure. Such pleasures seek, if private be thy end, if it be public, wide let them extend. Such pains avoid, whichever be thy view. If pains must come, let them extend to few. I guess they're memorator because they're meant to be memorable, but whether the rhymes themselves so that you can put them into practice in like legislation as a political agent. These verses raise even more questions than the prose account they summarize. But most of the qualities of pleasures and pains that Bentham mentions have to do with the epistemic and causal properties of the sensations rather than their measurement proper. Fruitfulness, for example, is just the tendency of a pleasure or pain to give rise to similar sensations, while certainty is just the probability it is reasonable to assign to a possible outcome. For individual pleasures and pains considered in themselves, their value is given by the product of their duration and their intensity. Sorry. This isn't entirely clear in Chapter 4, which asserts only that the value of a single pain or pleasure is some function of its intensity and duration. But Bentham makes his view explicit in the following passage. It is in respect to the aggregate of these, its three dimensions, that body is said to be great or small. It is of them that its magnitude is composed. Of those three dimensions, it is of them that its magnitude is composed. Its magnitude is the product of all of them together. Of pleasure, the same may be said in respect of its two dimensions. Its magnitude is the product of one of them by the other. It may seem quibbling to question Bentham's choice of multiplication as the appropriate function, but it raises a real problem. Even if we agree that pains and pleasures differ only in two respects, and that their relative values must be a function of these two respects, it is not at all clear how we are to decide which function is the right one. Bentham's choice of multiplication appears to be based solely on the analogy with the determination of geometric area. But there are other analogies at hand should we decide on, say, addition. If we want to determine Jones's total wealth, we don't multiply his saving account balance by his checking account balance, we add them. And of course, Bentham himself computes the total net utility of a society by summing rather than multiplying. But whatever function the utilitarian decides to use, numbers need to be assigned to intensity levels. Bentham simply assumes that this can be done and provides no clue about how it is to be accomplished. One way of attempting this is suggested, strangely enough, by Mill's claim that pleasures differ in quality as well as quantity. This claim, which some utilitarians view as an indispensable insight, and others see as a disastrous mistake, seems at first only to complicate the measurement problem. Mill's primary motivation for this claim was a desire to free utilitarianism from the criticism that it was a doctrine fit only for swine and gave no value to anything but the satisfaction of animal appetites. So higher and lower pleasures with equality introduction by Mill. The Epicureans had countered similar criticisms by pointing out that people, unlike pigs, could get pleasure from intellectual activity. They then went on to note that while the pleasures of the senses tend to be more intense than those of the intellect, the latter are more lasting, less costly, and better for your health. Mill agreed with this, but thought it left out the most important source of the greater value of the higher pleasures, namely their intrinsic nature. This point seemed to Mill both clear and clearly compatible with utilitarianism. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that, while in estimating all other things quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. What Mill declares absurd is just what Bentham takes to be obvious, namely that the value of a pleasure is a function of its intensity and duration. In a famous passage, Bentham explicitly denies that the higher pleasures are the more valuable. Prejudice apart, this is going to be in our excerpt that we'll actually read too. Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. Everybody can play at pushpin. Poetry and music are relished only by a few. To evaluate this dispute, we need to know how Mill determines the quality of a pleasure. He does it by appeal to the preferences of competent judges, i.e., people, quote, who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying, end quote, the pleasures under consideration. If such judges, or a majority among them, prefer the pleasures of poetry to those of pushpin, then the pleasures of poetry are more valuable than the pleasures of pushpin, irrespective of their relative intensities and durations. It is hard to see how this procedure is actually supposed to work, and harder still to see how it can be made to yield Mill's desired results without circularity. There is, to begin with, a problem in interpreting equally acquainted with. If it means has experienced an equal number of both pleasures, it seems overly restrictive. A few sentences before the one using equally acquainted, Mill employs instead competently acquainted. And in the sentence before that, he requires only that the judges have experience of both the pleasures. But if we require only that judges have experiences of both pleasures, it will almost certainly turn out that the pleasures of watching professional football are higher than those of watching grand opera or reading poetry. To match Mill's ranking of pleasures, we will have to lean heavily on notions like competent acquaintance and equal capacity for appreciation. And it is hard to see how these notions can be explained without appeal to the notion of higher pleasure itself. If the competence of a judge can only be decided by seeing if she prefers higher pleasures to lower ones, we can't appeal to the notion of a competent judge in explicating higher and lower pleasures, because then it's circular. But even if Mill's method of evaluating pleasures can't be made to rank them, as he thought they should be ranked, it suggests an interesting way to tackle the measurement problem, and one in fact adopted by many contemporary decision theorists. This approach, first articulated by Frank Plumpton Ramsey, begins with a person's ordinal preference, ranking over a large array of possible outcomes. Parenthetical, an ordinal preference ranking requires that a person decide whether two outcomes are equally desirable or that one is more desirable than the other, but not how much more desirable one is than the other. So you could create an entire hierarchy just by comparing one to the other. And the issue is that it would change depending on the context and the age and the actor and the history. If this ranking possesses a number of properties that it seems reasonable to think would characterize a rational agent's preferences, such as transitivity and additivity, for example, we can then create a utility function that assigns numbers to the outcomes. These numbers represent, on this view, the subjective value of each of the outcomes for the person in question. When applied to pleasures and pains, Ramsey's approach obviates or confuses, I'm pretty sure what that means. Like, um, e- equivocates, avoid, or need. Good thing we looked that up. When applied to pleasures and pains, um, Ramsey's approach obviates or avoids the need to assign values to intensity and duration and then decide what function to use to combine them. We need only ask, roughly, which batches of pains and pleasures are preferred to which. But you do that enough. So, like, you might have two that are lesser than, like, B and C might be less than A, but C might be preferable to B, and so you'd go A, C, B. And then D and E might both be preferable to A, but E might be more preferable to D. So you go E, D, A, C, B. Um, and then, you have another complex thing. You have F and G um, are again preferable to A, but G is less preferable than D, and F is more preferable than D. So it goes E, F, D, G, A, C, B. I guess I was using my imagination to keep track of that in a spatial way, which transcendentally probably means something, but we're not going to do that here. Sorry. I haven't read Kant yet. We're not going to do Kant. Um, I read Kant's cognitive philosophy, cognitive science. And this seems reasonable since, as Mill points out, quote, neither pains nor pleasures are homogeneous, and pain is always heterogeneous with pleasure. Hmm. What is there to decide whether a particular pleasure is worth purchasing at the cost of a particular pain, except the feelings and judgment of the experienced? So now we're sounding like Aristotle again. Of course, such preferences may vary from person to person, and that's another like issue with measurement and distribution. Smith may prefer a brief period of intense pain to a long siege of mild discomfort, while Jones may prefer the long siege, even though they agree about the intensity and duration of both experiences. And Brown may strongly prefer operative football, while Robinson enjoys the Super Bowl much more than she does La Boheme. La Boheme? La Boheme. I've had La Vie Boheme from Rent on my mind today. I've also been washing dishes. Unfortunately, Ramsey's approach, even if it works, provides only what economists call an intrapersonal utility scale. Just to that one person, like I said, you can't communicate between the measurements. To measure my losses against your gains, we need a way to make interpersonal comparisons. A gain of 10 on my intrapersonal scale can't be guaranteed to outweigh a gain of 5 on yours unless we're certain that we're using hedonic thermometers with the same calibration. So there's another problem in like analytic philosophy, and maybe it's in the modern point too. Like Locke might have had this problem, I'm not sure. But the question of whether we both see blue the same way, right? Not merely like do our cones register all the colors that are out there, but if color might be something unique to the mind, and certainly if color is tinged by neurochemical properties of perception and nutrition, and if it's tinged by psychoaffective properties of history, trauma, or positive association, affectively determining, hermeneutically determining what you perceive and what you don't perceive and how you interpret what you perceive. Anyway, my blue may not be your blue. I say that because I'm wearing a navy shirt. My pleasure, my like great, great pleasure may not be your great, great pleasure. And my great suffering may not be your great suffering. Um, Nietzsche says, for example, that it's disrespectful to ever think that we can understand each other's suffering, because it's so uniquely personal. And so to say, I get what you're going through is like rude. But then if you don't say that, what do you say? My friend had a death in the family recently, and she was having a hard time. So, um, I never know what to say. Of course, to be absolutely certain that we're using the same scale, would require solving the so-called problem of other minds and somehow gaining the sort of access to one another's mental states that we have to our own. But given our biological similarity and the hunch that what you say is pretty awful is just about as bad for you as what I call pretty awful is for me. So, like, we can't guarantee it, but we respect each other and we respect how we use language in similar circumstances. And we usually get feedback when people are like, no, I've had that. I've busted my knee from falling off a bike before. You'll be fine. Or, no, I've written a paper like that. Um, you can do it. You know, um, we can perhaps justify the assumption that once we've decided to assign -50 to what's pretty awful and +50 to what's pretty good, we'll be more or less in agreement. And of course, a utilitarian need not claim that interpersonal comparisons can always or even generally be made with a high degree of precision. All that is required is that interpersonal comparisons make sense, and that in some situations we can have good reason to think that some are true and others false. A utilitarian can and should also point out that any ethical system that accords weight to the hedonic consequences of actions will have to deal with the same measurement problems. And the utilitarian might gloat. Once I've made my measurements, my problems are over, while yours have just begun. But alas, while his opponent's troubles may have just begun, the utilitarians are not over. Bentham's argument for the principle of utility relies on the claim that it is capable of being consistently pursued, and it is but tautology to say that the more consistently it is pursued, the better it must always be for mankind. A century and a half later, Richard Brandt uh, made the same claim at greater length. Let us ask ourselves, what would a set of moral prescriptions be like, such that general conformity with it would have the best consequences? The answer is that a set would include just one rule, the prescription of the act-utilitarian. Perform an act among those open to you, which will have at least as good consequences as any other. There cannot be a moral rule, conformity, with which could have better consequences than this one. If it really is true that doing a certain thing will have the very best consequences in the long run, everything considered of all the things I can do, then there's nothing better I can do than this. If everyone always did the very best thing it was possible for him to do, the total intrinsic value would be at a maximum. These remarks may well sound like ringing changes onto like ringing changes on a tautology, but in fact the claim they make is false. It is false because each action in a pattern of actions can be such that any alternative to it would have been worse, even though some alternative pattern of action would have produced more net happiness than the actual pattern. So this is where we get to general utilitarianism, which is the integration of Kant's categorical imperative with a utilitarian mindset. I'm not sure if it's Kantian. I think it's more utilitarian than Kantian. I'm gonna get my water. It's almost empty, but this is my former students will recognize this water bottle, but they I don't see why they would be watching this video since I've already taught this lesson to them. We might have used it for Bergson too. Who knows? Consider, for example, the following situation. An election is being held and Bentham is running against Kant. If Bentham wins, there will be large utilitarian gains. He is therefore supported by all of the 40 million registered voters who are utilitarians. And let's suppose only by them. Kant is backed by 39,999,990 registered voters, 10 below Bentham. And all registered voters back either Bentham or Kant. Everyone knows all this, and everyone also knows that virtually all of Kant's backers will vote. They're fanatics and love voting. Bentham's backers find voting a pain in the neck. And each Bentham supporter knows that a fair percentage of the group isn't going to vote. So each knows that Kant will win whether or not he or she votes. So each stays home. Kant is elected, and things are much worse than they would have been had all of Bentham's supporters voted. Very interesting analogy. If we assume that the actions in this scenario are causally independent, then it will be true of each of the Bentham supporters that had she voted, things would have been worse. And not just for her, but for the society taken as a whole, since her loss would have produced no compensating gain. So each of the actions is in conformity with what Brand calls the prescription of the act utilitarian. And yet, le and yet, less net intrinsic good is produced than had everyone followed some alternative rule, e.g., vote whenever you have the opportunity, no matter what the probable outcome. So in the prisoner's dilemma, which we looked at in the first episode, not the last one, but the first one, rule utilitarianism would get around the prisoner's dilemma if you had a rule like don't snitch, or fidelity to your associations, fidelity to your causes, faithfulness to your commitments, your friends, a rule of not putting self-interest over mutual benefit. I mean, because in the prisoner's dilemma, the 2-2 is 4 years, defecting is 7 years, either way, and both defecting is 20 years. So you can do a rule utilitarian calculus to determine that both people should cooperate, and then they cooperate. Perhaps then utilitarians should look in formulating their principle not as at individual actions, but patterns of actions. So we haven't done rule utilitarianism yet, but and it's not there, doesn't seem like it's Schroeder's solution to what we were discussing either, but it's relevant. That's what I just discussed, and we'll move back onto the text now. One way to do this would be to formulate the principle of utility as do whatever you would be doing in a utilitarian optimal pattern of action. This formulation is similar to what is sometimes called generalized utilitarianism. This position attempts to combine a utilitarian characterization of the good with the requirement of universalizability set out in the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. The main problem, so that would work too. Um, the issue with the prisoner's dilemma, generalized utilitarianism would solve it as well because each person would want the other person to cooperate, because they would not want the other person to defect, certainly. Because when they both defect, it's much worse than they both cooperate. It's only egoism and hedonism that doesn't consider the other. All right. The main problem with this way of formulating the principle is that acting in accord with it may lead to disaster unless everyone follows it. Suppose in our voting case that the reason Bentham supporters, that seems like that's the same problem as deontology in general, though. Suppose in our voting case that the reason Bentham supporters find voting bothersome is not just the wait in line at the polling place, but the danger they will face if not enough Bentham supporters vote. Suppose that voting is by non-secret ballot, and that if Kant wins, he intends to take harsh retributive measures, sound familiar? Against all those who voted for Bentham. In this situation, any single act of voting by a Bentham supporter would have produced a very large loss of utility. So adoption of the rule, do your part in the optimal pattern for the situation by any individual or by any group of fewer than, say, 39 million Bentham supporters would be very bad. And the larger the group, short of 39 million, the worse it would be. These results are disconcerting. It seems that a reasonable formulation of the principle of utility should meet the following two criteria. It should guarantee that it should guarantee that anyone who successfully follows it is performing an action that produces at least as much net utility as any alternative open to him, and two, It should guarantee that if everyone successfully follows it, at least as much net utility will result as if everyone followed any alternative principle open to him or her. Brand's act-utilitarian prescription satisfies one, but not two. Do your part in an optimal pattern satisfies two, but not one. It is hard to see that any formulation could satisfy both one and two. I suspect that Bentham failed to see this problem because of his preoccupation with laws and legislation. A legislator can plausibly think of herself as imposing a pattern of action on a society, since the laws apply to everyone. Mill, more concerned than Bentham with individual moral decision-making, was also more worried about the relation between the injunction to maximize total net happiness and common sense moral principles like it's wrong to break promises. And there is some evidence that his views on this relation changed over time. In A System of Logic, he clearly holds that common sense principles are only, quote, rules of thumb. By a wise practitioner, therefore, rules of conduct will only be considered as provisional. Sorry, this is a long quote. By a wise practitioner, therefore, rules of conduct will only be considered as provisional, being made for the most numerous cases or for those of most ordinary occurrence. They point out the manner in which it will be least perilous to act, where time or means do not exist for analyzing the actual circumstances of the case, or we cannot trust our judgment in estimating them, but they do not at all supersede the propriety of going through. When circumstances permit, the scientific process requisite for framing a rule from the data of that particular case before us. 20 years later, in Utilitarianism, Mill sometimes writes as if common sense moral rules, which he now calls secondary principles, have a greater weight than mere rules of thumb. We must, quote, we must remember that only in ellipsis cases of conflict between secondary principles is it required that first principles should be appealed to. Passages like this have led some commentators to classify Mill as a rule utilitarian, i.e., as someone who holds that utility provides the ultimate ground for the adoption of rules and practices, but that an individual action that violates a rule or practice cannot be justified by simply showing that it produces more net utility than any alternative. A similar position is sometimes attributed to another of Bentham's followers, John Austin, the first occupant of the chair of jurisprudence at the Benthamite-founded University of London. According to Austin, our rules would be fashioned on utility, our conduct on our rules. I'll do that a little slower. According to Austin, our rules would be fashioned on quote, our rules would be fashioned on utility, semicolon, our conduct would be fashioned on, is in parentheticals there, our rules, end quote. If Austin is actually making a distinction between the justification of a rule and the justification of an action falling under a rule, and restricting the scope of utilitarianism to the former, then he owes us an account of what to do when an action falls under an unjustified rule. And the same is true of Mill if in fact he holds a position like Austin's. It is sometimes suggested by modern rule utilitarians that this difficulty can be avoided by asking not about actual rules and practices, but about the rules and practices that would be ideal for the society. Unfortunately, an act which is in accord with a system of ideal but unactualized rules or practices may be much worse than one which accords with the actual but non-ideal rules and practices, because you might be out of sync with the system. It should be stressed that the difficulties in formulating a principle of utility that we have discussed up to this point do not result from lack of information. Even assuming complete relevant information, it is unclear what rule a utilitarian should employ for choosing among the alternative actions open to her. But in real life, lack of relevant information is ubiquitous, and the utilitarian needs to say something about what we should do, and we have only very sketchy information about the consequences of our actions. This is particularly important for Mill, who realizes quite clearly that our actions have significant effects on what sort of people we become. His primary criticisms of Bentham, in fact, center on Bentham's neglect of the causal effects actions have on character. Quote, all acts suppose certain dispositions and habits of mind and heart, which may be in themselves states of enjoyment or of wretchedness, and which may be fruitful in other consequences besides those particular acts. No person can be a thief or a liar without being much else, and if our moral judgments and feelings with respect to a person, convicted of either vice, were grounded solely on the pernicious tendency of thieving and of lying, they would be partial and incomplete. Many considerations would be omitted, which are at least equally, quote, germane to the matter, end quote, and also end big block quote. But once we realize that becoming a person who always acts in a way that maximizes net utility or expected net utility is not necessarily what utilitarianism prescribes, we may be quite at a loss as to what it does prescribe. A similar problem confronts teleological theories of prudential, i.e., self-interested reason. So prudence is here seen as self-interest, and teleological means is referring to means and reasoning. Not an innate natural teleology like in the world or in nature about like a design or something. Once the prudential teleologist realizes that following the principle always chose the action, probably should be always choose the action that will maximize self-interest, will not guarantee a prudentially optimal life, it is not clear what principle of choice she should adopt. Given the obscurity of its implications for action, one might question how Mill could be so certain of the truth of utilitarianism. Part of the answer is that he assumed it was obvious that practical reason is means and rationality. Thus, there must be a summum bonum, or highest good, and actions must somehow aim at maximizing it. But why was Mill so certain that the summum bonum is total net happiness? And what does net mean? How do we calculate net? Mill gives his answer to this question in chapter 4 of Utilitarianism, where he considers of what sort of proof the principle of utility is susceptible. This section of utilitarianism has provoked more commentary and more controversy than any other part of the book. Nonetheless, the broad outlines of Mill's argument are reasonably clear. The thesis that Mill wants to establish in chapter 4 is the claim that only happiness is intrinsically good, i.e., good in itself and not just as a means to some other good. It is somewhat misleading, perhaps, to call this, quote, the principle of utility, but it is clear in the context what Mill has in mind. And Mill is quite clear, here and earlier, that first principles do not admit of strict proof, since their role is to function as bedrock premises. Nonetheless, they may be supported by quote, considerations capable of determining the intellect, end quote. See below, page 98. The considerations Mill offers begin with the assumptions that there is, in fact, a summum bonum, and that it is something that can be desired as an end, i.e., desired for itself or intrinsically. Mill offers no explicit argument for the claim that being capable of being desired is a necessary condition for being desirable, but he does note that, quote, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that a thing is desirable is that people do actually desire it. And indeed, it would be odd if something was intrinsically desirable, but impossible to desire. If we give Mill the premise that being capable of being desired is a necessary condition for being desirable, then to show that happiness is the summum bonum, he need only convince us that it is impossible to desire anything but happiness as an end. And indeed, the bulk of chapter 4 is an attempt to establish just this. Mill begins by noting that we do in fact desire happiness, and this of course shows that we can desire happiness. He then considers a number of instances in which we might be tempted to hold that things other than happiness, such as money, are desired as ends, and argues that in each instance it is plausible to claim that what would appear to be independent ends are actually parts of the agent's happiness. This is the best, I would say, elements there. This is the best that Mill can do. Given his belief that the only way to prove a modal claim of the form X can be desired is by producing a case in which X actually is desired, it will be impossible for him to demonstrate that only happiness can be desired as an end. The best he can do is to show that there is no reason to think that we can in fact desire anything else as an end. But even if in fact everyone's sole end is happiness, this will not prove that nothing else could be desired. As an end. It would, however, be very strong evidence that happiness is the sole intrinsic good. This, I think, is why Mill withholds the claim of proof, but maintains that he has nonetheless presented considerations capable of determining the intellect. On this reading of Mill's argument, it contains no flawed analogies or logical lapses, but it still faces at least two serious objections. The first concerns Mill's method of dealing with apparent counterexamples to his claim that happiness is the sole end. It is quite natural to say that some people want power or posthumous fame or revenge or preservation of endangered species, and that they want these as ends. Indeed, it seems natural to say that some of these people desire these ends more than they desire happiness. Perhaps there is some way to diffuse these apparent counterexamples. But simply saying that in all such cases the agents have made power or revenge or posthumous fame, quote, part of their happiness, end quote, is to make the claim that happiness is the sole end, quote, true by definition, end quote, and hence trivial, begging the question circular. The second problem facing Mill's argument is that the conclusion he wants is that the summum bonum is the general good. But his examples seem to show that what each agent desires is her own happiness. However implausible it may be to say that each agent desires nothing but his own happiness, it is surely more implausible to say that each agent wants only the general happiness. Moreover, Mill's method of handling apparent counterexamples will only work for single agent cases. The miser may make money a part of his happiness, but he does not thereby make it a part of mine. Mill seems to have been aware that there was a gap between what he argues for in chapter 4 and what he wants as a conclusion, but his attempt to bridge it is both unclear and unconvincing. He writes in paragraph 3 of chapter 4 that, quote, no reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, desires his own happiness, Each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. End quote. Mill in Utilitarianism provides no explanation of why the fact that each person desires his own happiness makes the general happiness desirable, nor does he explain what it means to say that something is a good to an aggregate of people. When queried about this apparent lacuna in his reasoning, Mill replied that, quote, when I said that the general happiness is a good to the aggregate of all persons, I did not mean that every human being's happiness is a good to every other human being, though I think in a good state of society and education it would be so. I merely meant in this particular sentence to argue that since A's happiness is a good, B's a good, C's a good, etc., the sum of all these goods must be a good. Unfortunately, the two sentences of Mill's explanation conflict. The first implies that something is a good for A. Sorry. The first entails that what is a good for A may not be a good for B. While the second implies that if something is a good for A, it is a good simpliciter, and hence presumably a good for B. But in fact, no explanation of what it is to be a good simpliciter, as opposed to being a good for a particular agent, has been given. These two objections to Mill's argument are quite formidable, and replies that meet one tend to exacerbate the other. One way to meet the first problem, for example, sorry, I'm gonna have to drink some more water. All right, I'm back. I didn't have to go get any more, so finish what was in the bottle. This is the last page of the introduction, and then there's 2 pages of footnotes. And I'm not going to read all the footnotes, but there are a few that I think are helpful that I want to like probably check out. So I'm going to blow my nose too. All right, seems better. One way to meet the first problem, for example, is to admit that agents have varying ends. And then to define happiness is roughly, quote, getting what one wants. The summum bonum is then defined as total net satisfaction of desires, with everyone's desires counting equally and with a value proportionate to their intensity. This sort of position is sometimes called preference utilitarianism, and many contemporary philosophers and economists endorse one of its many versions. Unfortunately, um, yeah, I didn't really mention this in any of my past semesters. Unfortunately, while it does full justice to the diversity of what agents desire as ends, it makes it quite difficult to see why any agent would want to maximize total preference satisfaction. Suppose, for example, that Agent A has as one of his most fervent ends the elimination of all Jews from Palestine, while Agent B wants nothing more than a secure Jewish state in the Middle East. Why should either be interested in having the other get what he wants? Um, Mischaracterization there, totally. Um, Israel is a colonizer, obviously, for Palestine. The Zionists took over. They began purchasing land that was for sale, with the intent of gentrifying and just taking over ownership control of the area, basically buying out from all over the world. And they weren't just Jewish. Some are Christian Zionists. It's just Zionism that's really the problem. Not, it's definitely not Judaism, obviously. Um, I don't think anybody is denying citizenship to Jewish people, but Israel is certainly denying citizenship, rights, mobility, freedom, food, opportunities, technology, to the Palestinians, both the West Bank and Gaza. So the better way to frame this is whenever one agent has violent ends, you don't tolerate it. This last problem surfaces in more concrete form in Mill's On Liberty. This work, probably Mill's most influential, presents a strong and impassioned case for many of the most basic civil liberties, e.g., freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. It also argues for what at least sounds like a very high degree of individual freedom of action. Mill asserts that everyone should be free to do whatever she wants as long as doing so does not harm anyone else. Neither the state nor private individuals should be allowed to restrict an agent's liberty unless the exercise of that liberty harms or threatens to harm others. Mill limits this guarantee to rational agents. It is not intended to apply to small children or to adults who remain in their quote non-age. Non-age, I'm not sure. It is also important to note that Mill does not think it is permissible to limit your freedom whenever the exercise of that freedom harms others. Political speech, for example, often harms incumbents or leads to policies which harm one or another social class or group, but Mill thinks such speech should nonetheless be protected. Mill's principle claims that harm to others is a necessary condition for legitimate limitation of freedom, not that it is a sufficient condition for such limitation. If we ask when the exercise of a liberty that harms others should be impinged, Mill would surely answer, quote, when the total net utility of the impingement over the length of its employment is greater than the total net utility of the unrestricted exercise of the liberty, end quote. Mill is quite certain that the claim is made um, and on liberty are consistent with the basic tenets of utilitarianism, and his defense of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, is based solely on the utility of the exercise of these liberties. Nonetheless, many readers feel there is a tension between the claims, or at least the tenor of the two books. And indeed, it does sometimes seem that Mill's defense of basic liberties, for example, freedom of speech, is rooted in the value he himself places on these liberties, rather than on a clear perception that their exercise will in fact maximize total net utility. Mill's official opinion, of course, is that value judgments based solely on individual preference are simply expressions of sympathy or antipathy and have to be based on reason if they are to be taken seriously. Because of this, Mill feels no hesitancy in condemning a hypothetical prohibition against eating pork in a predominantly Muslim country or the actual prohibition of Mormon polygamy in America. Yet, in Chapter 4, Mill allows the legitimate prohibition of certain offenses against decency. Mill Mill is not explicit about what activities he has in mind, but presumably public nudity would be among them. But how is he to distinguish a ban on public nudity from a requirement that women wear veils, or that men wear beards, or that no one eat pork? More seriously, how is Mill going to justify his strong preference for individual differences and eccentricity, as opposed to the more general preference for conformity? If in fact a growing number of people make conformity, quote, a part of their happiness, end quote, how is utilitarianism going to prevent the, quote, tyranny of the majority, end quote, that Mill wants to avoid? There will be an answer to this problem if in fact rational agents can come to an agreement on what is intrinsically desirable. If, for example, everyone were to agree that only pleasant sensations are intrinsically desirable, their value depends only on their being experienced and not on who experiences them, such Benthamite pleasures could serve as a common coin for computing the sum of the happiness of a group of individuals, and each individual could reasonably be supposed to want to maximize that sum. Um, this happens a lot kind of with money, whether we like it or not. But money is faulty because you can have more money and things can get more expensive, right? The worth of the money is important. And that's determined by the value or the virtue of labor itself, and the social virtues of an economy, and the social virtues of the character of its people. How much they're allowed to rest, how much they're trusted, how good of people they are. All of that will strengthen the dollar by necessarily being more trustworthy and more valuable. And then you could have like money as a sort of, you really couldn't though, because you have to go back to strengthening the integrity. The integrity has to be, anyway, you would want to maximize character instead of utility. Um, or maximize the production of character, opportunities for the production of character. But if disagreement about what is intrinsically desirable emerges, summation becomes problematic. If you value diversity and I value conformity, I don't, saying that we both want happiness runs a danger of becoming an empty claim, and of providing no clear reason why either of us should want to maximize total happiness. What the utilitarian needs, then, is an account of the good such that all rational agents will agree that its maximization is indeed the summum bonum. I think character is the answer here. Bentham and Mill were deeply convinced that such an account must exist on pain of practical reason degenerating to the principle of sympathy and antipathy, which, as Bentham made clear, is no principle at all. Their attempts to illuminate this basic utilitarian vision and to trace its practical implications continue to attract followers in philosophy, economics, and public choice theory, and to inspire many to elaborate and defend their theory. The work of later utilitarians such as Edgeworth and Sidgwick in the 19th century and Brandt and Hare in the 20th provides an impressive tribute to the fecundity of writings of Bentham and Mill. I hope that these selections from their writings will show that a deeper study of the early utilitarians is well worth the effort. All right, 7. Um, it is worth noting that even in cases where both variables are maximized, the principle may prefer a distribution that has nothing to be said for it from either a utilitarian or an egalitarian point of view. Consider, for example, D5, 850 people at level 780, 150 people at level 0, or D6, 800 people at level 750, 200 people at level 700. Here, the greatest level of happiness occurs in D5, and more people enjoy the greatest good in D5 than in D6. But both classical utilitarians and standard egalitarians would prefer D6 to D5. Yeah, and it just seems because like you can, right? Like if the option is to have nobody at zero and reduce the happiness of most people by just like a minuscule amount to make sure that everyone else has like pretty close to them. I mean, it's not even like, this is not a downward leveling at all. 30 points out of 750, like it's not much. Out of 780, 750, whatever. Technically, you take it out of the original for a percent change. The percent change would be negative 20, uh, negative 26, negative, no, negative 1 over 26, like negative 4%, negative 3.8. Cool. Percent change is the difference divided by the original. So it went down by 3.8%, which is, minuscule, right? Like it's just inflation or something. And everybody else got lifted. 9, it goes back at least to G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, which takes both beauty and aesthetic appreciation, among other things, as intrinsic goods. 10, for an example of this sort of ecumenism, see Richard Brandt's account of what he calls extended rule utilitarianism. Brandt, 1950. These years don't mean anything to you because you don't have the full citation. 11, for a useful discussion of some of these measures, see Sen. 12, for a criticism of this line of argument, see Timken. 14, did the verses really mean to imply, for example, that even, quote, if private be, end quote, my end, I must take into account the pains of others, though I may ignore their pleasures? If so, why? And does the prose of chapter 4 really mean that I should discount once for uncertainty and again for propinquity? If so, why? I don't really know what that means. 16, I don't myself think addition is a likely function for Bentham's purposes, but there are also real doubts about the appropriateness of multiplication. It isn't obvious that a pain that has intensity 100 and a duration of 1 minute is no better or worse than a pain of intensity 1 that lasts 100 minutes. For details on how this can be done, see Ramsey. 19, this was, to the best of my knowledge, first shown in Gibbert, 1965. 20, note that each act of voting by Smith's supporters is also in accord with the act-utilitarian principle. And note also that the voting case bears a strong structural similarity to prisoner's dilemma cases. In general, the basic difficulties afflicting teleological theories of prudential rationality mirror those facing teleological theories of moral rationality. For a clear introduction to prisoner's dilemma cases, see the introduction to Axelrod in 1984. 21, this sort of position is, in Mill's opinion, the one Kant himself actually held. 23, for more on the distinction Austin might be making, as well as the question of whether he or Mill made it, see Rawls, 1955. 25, the fact that teleological theories carry no obvious implications for decision-making, even given full relevant information, has its upside. If it isn't clear what utilitarianism tells us to do, then it can't be the case that it clearly tells us to do the intuitively wrong things. 26, for a good argument that people in fact have ends that transcend any experiential states of themselves or others. See Nozick's discussion of the, quote, experience machine, end quote. Nozick, 1974. I think this is similar to the utility monster, but I'm not quite sure. Um, I think I think it's different in an important way, but it might not be. But I'm leaning towards it being different in an important way. 27. There have been ingenious attempts to meet this and similar problems by restricting the sorts of preferences that, quote, count, but none has gained general acceptance. The theory also faces serious problems stemming from the fact that preferences change over time. For an interesting discussion of the superiority of the, quote, desire satisfaction, quote, end quote, version of utilitarianism and a perplexing rejection of it, more of in favor of a more traditional form, see Brandt, 1979. 28. It is a bit disconcerting to learn that Mill thinks whole societies may be in their, quote, non-age. Does Mill think that, quote, primitive societies lack rationality, or only the information needed to make rationality useful? Which would make it very colonial and hierarchical and unfounded, generally unfounded, just like sort of Western centrism. 29. For a clear statement of this claim, see the first half of Chapter 1 of On Liberty. 30. For a cogent counter to Bentham's claim, see Rawls, 1971. When was the idea of justice? That's probably the what he's quoting right there, for the counter to Bentham's claim. Um, all right, guys, that's the introduction. Let me pop that off. We'll do the we'll cut the episode here. We'll come back and do. I don't think we can do it all in one video. I'd like to, but probably two videos. It's 22 pages. Thanks for being here. I think pragmatism will be more fun. See you guys in the next one. Take care.